Is the economic a distinctive feature of liberation theology? Is the economic a distinctive feature of liberation theology? It's a question that haunts this paper of mine and haunts my own work. A neglected contributing voice to this question is Ujamaa theology, which emerged in Tanzania in the 1960s. Ujamaa theology was forged in the Tanzanian context after Uhuru, national independence, in 1961. The term Ujamaa was used by Julius Nyerere, the leader of the Tanganyika African National Union, TANU, formed in 1954, and the vehicle of African nationalism and African liberation. To articulate, the Ujamaa was used to articulate for Nyerere a post-colonial vision of African socialism. Why, asks Per Frostin from Sweden, whose incisive analysis of Tanzanian Ujamaa liberation theology undergirds my analysis. Why, asks Frostin, did Nyerere launch a new political philosophy the year after Uhuru? Why did he call people to struggle against dependence when the nation had just been granted sovereignty after 75 years of colonial rule? Why Ujamaa after Uhuru? The answer to these questions, Frostin responds, resides in the interrelation of politics, economy, and culture. Nyerere understands that notwithstanding political independence, there is still need for an economic and cultural liberation. The struggle, Frostin argues, is for liberation from the global capitalist system that significantly is not seen as an economic structure only, but also as a threat to the cultural values of Ujamaa. And for anyone interested in this book of Per Frostin's, which looks at Ujamaa theology and South African Black theology, if you email me, I'll send you a copy of the book. We have now produced it in an e-version that you can have freely. In an essay published in 1962 entitled Ujamaa, The Basics of African Socialism, Nyerere begins with cultural decolonization. Our first step must be to re-educate ourselves, he says, to regain our former attitude of mind. In our traditional African society, we were individuals within a community. We took care of the community, and the community took care of us. And in rejecting the capitalist attitude of mind, which colonialism brought to Africa, Nyerere continues, we must reject also the capitalist methods which go with it, rejecting the attitude of mind and the methods. Cultural decolonization requires economic decolonization. Now, what's significant about Ujamaa as a political theory, and I'll conclude with this in terms of Ujamaa, the emphasis on self-reliance, African self-reliance, locates Ujamaa within the trajectory of other third world liberation theologies, their understanding of dependency or development theory. Now, given this brief account, and my paper will say more about this, given this brief account of Ujamaa political philosophy, we turn now to analyze the theological reflection done within this context. So I turn now to Ujamaa theology. Ujamaa theology serves Ujamaa political theory. It serves Ujamaa political theory by articulating, firstly, a profound understanding of God as community. God as community. And this is articulated in different ways within Ujamaa theology. For example, taking up the classical anthropological theme of Imago Dei, Nyerere maintains that God is degraded when human beings are degraded. In addition to this invocation of the theological concept of Imago Dei, Ujamaa theologians interpret the Trinity within the framework of a fundamental contradiction between selfishness and community. Thirdly, another theological concept summoned forth by Ujamaa political theory and praxis is that of systemic sin or crime. Laurenti Magesa speaks of how colonial rule committed sins and crimes in Africa, not just crimes, sins also, right? Alongside socioeconomic sin, Magesa reflects theologically on the gravest sin of them all, that the Tanzanian was made to consider himself or herself an inferior being. Another theological concept, fourthly, such theological arguments against colonial capitalism and colonial cultural dependency may be summarized, says Frostine, in the Kiswahili saying, Abepari ni unyama. Capitalism is bestial. Unyama, bestiality, is here the opposite of utu, humanity. The main contradiction is not between theocentrism and anthropocentrism, or between the sacred and the secular, but rather between Ujamaa and ubunifasi, selfishness. Now, an important clarification needs to be made at this point as we talk about Ujamaa theology. And that is how we understand the relationship between Ujamaa political theology, Ujamaa political theory and Ujamaa theology. The main point of the political philosophy of Ujamaa in matters of faith is to create space for religious conviction, but not to prescribe a certain religious conviction, with the important exception that spirituality in the Ujamaa concept, in the Ujamaa context, must be humanistic. In this context, one should not forget the Muslim contribution to Ujamaa, shaped by Sufi fraternities and their forms of Islam in Tanzania, with their strong egalitarian ethics. Crucially, even though the philosophy of Ujamaa is clearly religiously inspired, no single religion is its source in an exclusive sense. Interreligious collaboration is summoned by Ujamaa political theory and praxis to provide appropriate religious resources. A religion, listen to this, colleagues, a religion is only liberative insofar as it has the theological capacity to serve a liberative political economic project. And African traditional religion is a partner in this. So Ujamaa political theory laments how religion, whether Christianity or Islam, tends to be dichotomous and turns to African religion as something that holds the so-called spiritual and so-called secular as a unity. Religious diversity summons both interreligious collaboration and intra-religion particularity, discerning what resources within a particular religious tradition are relevant and redemptive for African socialism. I conclude briefly with some reflections on the Bible. Among the aspects of Ujamaa and Ujamaa theology that have proved to be problematic, including insufficient analysis of the inclusion of women and of class divisions within ethnic groups, a monovocal Bible is another problem. Ujamaa theology has no explicit biblical hermeneutic. As we have seen, the hermeneutic is theological. Now, as a South African, we turn to the work of Itumeleng Masala when it comes to the Bible. who has argued that the Bible is itself a site of struggle. Indeed, Masala goes on to argue that when contemporary struggles turn to the Bible, they hear only the poetry, and that's his language, the poetry of silence. The poetry of silence, which the struggle itself then has to fill. Now, I turn in the final section of my paper to the work of Nyerere in his retirement when he begins to translate the Bible. And I want to argue that what Nyerere does with the Bible is not to have a poetry of silence and of absence, but a poetry of presence. What Nyerere does is to adopt the traditional tenzi poetic form, common in Islamic culture of his people, and uses this poetic form to translate the Bible. And he uses the form in a way that goes beyond the kind of normal translation one would find for the Bible, because he needs to make the Bible fit the poetic form. And he does this in various ways, and part of what he does is to add to the Bible. He adds to the Bible. And so I'm wanting to argue that Nyerere offers us another way, alongside Masala's way, alongside Masala's poetics of silence and absence. Nyerere offers us, through his translation theology, a poetics of addition, inclusion, and presence. Thank you.
And briefly, my thoughts on Gerald and Yasmin's presentations, which were, I enjoyed them. And Gerald, I think, fitted in with the previous papers. And for me, briefly, I think what was of interest was when he spoke of Masala's poetry of silence and Nyerere's poetics of addition. I don't know what they are, but I would love to know more about that. And I was wondering, because I always wonder with issues of Bible translation, because I think so much is lost in Bible translation, and what qualifies as addition when you translate something, because I always think sometimes so much is lost when you translate from one culture to another. Then from Yasmin's presentation, I wondered, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, I'm a New Testament scholar, but I wondered if canonization contributed at all to the exclusion of women from the priesthood. That's just a question I have. I don't know if it's possible to answer it from a historical perspective, or if it's not possible. Thank you, Siame.
And the reason I turned to Nyerere's notions of translation is precisely because Chengi has raised this important point of the power of translation. The single biggest industry in biblical studies on the African continent is translation. And a great deal of translation work has historically been in the hands of sort of neo-colonial forces. And that's changed. I mean, we do have very significant African translators, but a lot of the very early translations we have, the first translations, are extremely worrying in all sorts of ways, ideologically very shaped by missionary colonialism. And so what's essential in African contexts is the notion of retranslation. We can't sit with translation. We've got to move on to retranslation. And we've got to be intentional about what it means to translate as African, which is why Nyerere, I think, is very exciting, because he's not afraid to be an African translator. He uses Kiswahili lexical items, both archaic and more contemporary, and he allows indigenous poetic form to shape what the Bible should look like. And I think we need to embrace these notions of translation. So that's how I would respond. Translation is power, and unless we take that power, we will always be beholden to missionary colonial power in translation.